The morning air hung thick and humid over Japan's Honshu Island. As a lone aircraft pierced through the clouds, what happened in the following seconds would forever alter humanity's understanding of destruction. A single explosive device tumbled from the belly of that plane, and when it detonated above the bustling streets below, it unleashed forces that humanity had never before witnessed on a battlefield. Over 100,000 souls vanished in moments, their final breaths stolen by fire and pressure beyond comprehension. 3 days later, history repeated itself on Kyushu Island, adding tens of thousands more to a death count that would haunt the world for generations. Yet the truly horrifying chapter of this story begins not with the blinding flash or the thunderous roar, but with what came after. When the dust settled and the fires cooled, the living faced a nightmare that no amount of military training or civilian preparedness could have anticipated. The streets that once buzzed with daily commerce now presented a landscape so disturbing that many survivors would struggle to find words adequate to describe it. The question that paralyzed city officials and traumatized residents alike was simple yet overwhelming. What do you do with mountains of human remains in cities that no longer functioned? Understanding the magnitude of this crisis requires grappling with numbers that remain frustratingly uncertain even decades later. Hiroshima held roughly 340,000 residents before that August morning. By the time November arrived, 4 out of every 10 people had perished. The second targeted city housed between 195,000 and 240,000 inhabitants, with somewhere between 60 and 80,000 dying before the year ended. A military medical officer speaking before Congress admitted his embarrassment at being unable to provide concrete figures beyond educated speculation. The only verifiable data he could offer was that by early October, authorities had documented cremating 40,000 bodies, though he suspected another 20 or 30,000 remained buried in rubble or consumed entirely by flames. The combined death toll estimates swing wildly from 110,000 to over 210,000, with countless others succumbing later to injuries and illnesses that would take years to fully manifest. This uncertainty stems from multiple factors, but perhaps the most disturbing is the condition of the victims themselves. Many bodies simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. Popular mythology suggests that people nearest the blast were transformed instantly into vapor, leaving nothing behind but eerie shadows burned into concrete and stone. The reality, while slightly less mystical, remains equally disturbing. These shadows resulted from a phenomenon called thermal bleaching, where intense heat scoured exposed surfaces while objects or people blocking that energy left dark silhouettes on the ground behind them. The human beings who cast those shadows were not vaporized, but rather incinerated so completely that only fragments remained, teeth and bone chips that offered no way to identify individuals or sometimes even confirm they had once been human at all. One survivor navigating the devastated landscape described an eerily empty scene, recalling the absence of visible corpses. Despite knowing thousands had died in the immediate vicinity, countless memorial stones throughout the city bear names, but no physical remains to inter beneath them. This experience, however, stood in stark contrast to what others witnessed. A young girl venturing out 3 days after the attack would never forget what she called a hellscape, with half-burned bodies rigid on the ground, eyeballs protruding grotesquely from skulls. Dead cattle lined the roads, their stomachs bloated beyond recognition. Rivers became highways of death, with thousands of corpses bobbing in the current, swollen and purple from absorbing water. City authorities faced an impossible situation. Any hope of rebuilding required clearing the streets of human remains, and quickly. The bombs had fallen during the hottest, most humid month of the year, with temperatures climbing above 30 degrees Celsius and humidity hovering between 70 and 80%. Bodies decomposed at alarming rates under these conditions. One 17-year-old survivor remembered the overwhelming stench of rotting flesh, though he noted that after a while, the smell became just another part of the background, something the mind learned to filter out in order to maintain sanity. The question of how to safely approach this massive cleanup operation raised concerns about radiation that turned out to be somewhat misplaced. Certainly, many victims died from acute radiation exposure, but these were people caught in the initial blast itself. The residual radiation levels proved far less dangerous than expected, largely because these primitive weapons were detonated hundreds of meters above ground level. Roughly 90% of the radiation was pulled up into the atmosphere, leaving ground contamination lower than one might assume. Furthermore, The most dangerous radioactive isotope left behind had an incredibly short half-life, decaying to relatively safe levels within days. Within 10 days, radioactivity had decreased by a factor of 1 million. This meant that entering the disaster zones in the days and weeks following the attacks would not necessarily result in death from radiation exposure. The far greater danger came from the physical destruction itself, the mountains of rubble and collapsed buildings that trapped tens of thousands of bodies beneath them. Rather than risk Japanese lives with this hazardous recovery work, authorities turned to forced laborers from Korea, people who already occupied the lowest rungs of the social hierarchy. One survivor who was only 3 years old during the attack later described how Korean workers bore the burden of clearing corpses, initially using stretchers before the sheer volume of bodies forced them to resort to dustpans to gather human remains, and many of these forced laborers died during recovery operations, contributing to a disproportionately high death rate among the Korean population. Estimates suggest that 57% of Koreans in Hiroshima perished in the bombing and its aftermath, compared to roughly 40% of the overall population in both cities. Despite these terrible conditions and the heavy cost in human lives, recovery teams did manage to retrieve and remove countless bodies from the devastated urban landscapes. For the survivors left behind, grief demanded expression through traditional funeral rites that suddenly seemed impossible to perform properly. Japanese funeral customs begin almost immediately after death, with family and friends gathering to offer condolences and honor the deceased through prayers and observances. Close relatives traditionally maintain a vigil throughout the night, remaining with the body as the soul begins its journey beyond the living world. The funeral itself typically commences the following day, with the deceased receiving a new Buddhist name to prevent their spirit from returning. If someone calls their old name, flowers are placed around the head before the casket closes, and then cremation occurs afterward. Relatives use special chopsticks to carefully transfer charred bone fragments from the ashes into a ceremonial urn. This process, bound up in ritual and conducted with meticulous care, became nearly impossible to execute properly in the chaotic aftermath of nuclear devastation. One 11-year-old boy later provided a harrowing account of cremating his father's body with his brothers. They gently placed his blackened, swollen corpse atop a burned beam where they had found him and set it ablaze, watching helplessly as his ankles protruded at awkward angles, while flames consumed the rest of his body. Returning the next morning to collect ashes, they discovered the cremation had been incomplete. Only his wrists, ankles, and part of his midsection had burned properly, while the rest lay raw and decomposed. His oldest brother suggested taking a piece of skull, following traditional practice where family members pass a small fragment with chopsticks after cremation. But when their chopsticks touched the surface, the skull cracked open like plaster, and half-cremated brain matter spilled out. The brothers screamed and fled, abandoning their father in the worst possible state. This young man was at least fortunate enough to locate his father's body. Countless others went unidentified and unclaimed, strewn around neighborhoods with no one to name them or tend to them. Rivers and channels became packed tightly with limbless bodies in extreme states of decomposition. Even children were pressed into service carrying corpses to mass cremation sites on straw mats. One survivor believed her father cremated 700 people on the street directly in front of their home. Traditional rites and observances became luxuries that time and circumstances simply would not permit. On a nearby island where tens of thousands of wounded were evacuated, doctors fought desperately to save lives even as thousands died. Their identities were lost in the chaos of emergency cremations and burials, leaving the island dotted with unmarked graves containing thousands of unidentified remains. A university researcher continues returning to the island each year searching for these graves, believing that locating remains and providing proper funerals can bring peace to the few survivors who remain. Until that happens, he says, the war is not truly over for these people. As important as disposing of bodies was, survivors faced another urgent challenge: understanding and treating the mysterious illnesses that began afflicting people who had survived the initial blast. Across both cities, victims started succumbing to baffling symptoms as their bodies seemed to fail on a fundamental level. One 18-year-old who had been living about a kilometer from the main strike suffered severe burns but made it to a hospital, where he watched fellow victims die one after another. Day after day, he remembered urinating blood that dyed the white toilet bowl red. convinced he would be next as he stared at it in despair. In the other city, a 9-year-old girl living nearly 2 kilometers from the blast center watched her 3-year-old sister struggle to survive. Her sister's hair came out with the lightest touch, and a hole in her cheek grew large enough to expose her split tongue. A month later, both her sister and aunt were dead. Over the following years, most of her family, including her younger brother, would die of cancer. A brutal reminder of the bomb's lingering destructive power. Understanding what was happening became crucial for multiple reasons. Japanese doctors and scientists needed to determine how to treat survivors and prevent a long-lasting health catastrophe. American military scientists wanted precise data on what their new weapon could actually do. Radiation poisoning was not entirely unknown by the 1940s. As early as the 1920s, women working with radium-based paint at American instrument factories had begun exhibiting disturbing symptoms after habitually licking their brushes before painting watch faces. Many suffered devastating damage to their jawbones as radiation caused fractures and degradation. At least 50 died as a result. A decade later, the pioneering scientist Marie Curie died of aplastic anemia, a death not fully understood at the time but later confirmed to result from long-term radiation exposure. Her papers remain so radioactive that handling them requires protective equipment. However, even with these precedents, the events in these 2 Japanese cities were unprecedented, enough that a new word was created to describe the patients: Hibakusha, or bomb-affected people. To understand what was happening, doctors and coroners conducted autopsies on bodies exhibiting the most extreme radiation damage. One such body belonged to a 36-year-old stage actress who survived the initial blast and was pulled from a destroyed building's ruins, but her injuries proved overwhelming. Open sores covered her body, and doctors found themselves powerless against her baffling symptoms. The radiation had destroyed her white blood cells, leaving her body defenseless against infection. She died on August 24th, becoming the first victim to have radiation poisoning officially listed as her cause of death. Her life was over, but her story continued, as grim as it sounds. Her body was too valuable to medical science to simply dispose of according to traditional customs. Knowledge gained from studying her remains may have helped many others get the treatment they needed to survive. Yet Japanese doctors still faced tremendous obstacles in gaining the insights they desperately needed. Despite entering into a partnership with Japan after the war, American authorities proved reluctant to share research results. The Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission seemed more concerned with safeguarding valuable data about their new weapon than actually treating its victims. Even doctors treating Hibakusha daily had no access to critical findings that could have supported diagnosis and care. One physician working in the affected area expressed anger at American policy, describing their research approach as unnecessarily secretive. He argued that doctors discovering something new while conducting research are obligated to make findings public for the benefit of all humanity. Many tissue samples collected by American researchers, including hearts, lungs, and brains of victims, remained in storage in the United States for decades after the war ended. Repatriation did not begin until May 1973, by which time many samples had been mislabeled, misidentified, or simply lost. The atomic bombings remain etched into the identity of both cities even decades later. The blast's hypocenter continues serving as a geographical reference point. A particular street sits about 1.5 kilometers away, a building 500 meters north. No further explanation is required. Yet despite the looming shadow of nuclear destruction, both cities have recovered remarkably. By the early 1950s, their populations had returned to pre-war levels, and both have become significant cultural and economic centers in modern Japan. Somber memorials stand in both locations commemorating the destruction wrought in August 1940-5. Perhaps the most important memorial, however, is more subtle: the continued existence of the cities themselves. For a time, it appeared, both had been erased from the map entirely. Their recovery was always going to be a long and agonizing journey, but it would not have been possible at all without that crucial first step. That step was the grim but necessary process of bearing away the bodies of those who died, the first victims of a weapon that forever changed warfare and introduced humanity to an age of existential dread that continues to this day. This story demands that we remember not just the statistics or the strategic implications, but the human cost measured in individual tragedies, in families torn apart, in traditions interrupted, in dignity denied even in death. The shadows burned into concrete serve as permanent reminders, but the real memorial lives in our collective memory and our determination to ensure such weapons are never again used against civilian populations. Share this account with others who need to understand the true human cost of nuclear warfare, because only through understanding can we hope to prevent history from repeating its darkest chapters.